Good evening, everyone. I'm Professor Michelle Foster, the Dean of Melbourne Law School, and it is such a pleasure to welcome you here tonight to the Law School for the 2026 MLS Rare Books Lecture. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging that we are gathering on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I pay my respects to Elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people who are joining us this evening. Well, the Rare Books Lecture Series began in 2002 as an opportunity to showcase the Law Library's remarkable rare books collection. Since then, it has evolved into a forum for exploring broader questions about law, history and society, using items from the collection as a springboard for deeper discussion. Our Rare Books collection represents an important public collection of rare and early legal texts, including early printed law books, law reports, 17th century political pamphlets, classic legal texts, and material relating to Australian Federation and the early years of the Commonwealth. It is of research significance not only to lawyers, but also to researchers of legal, social and cultural history. And I would like to especially acknowledge tonight Carol Hinchcliffe, who is our wonderful law librarian, who oversees this valuable collection and continues to champion this annual lecture as part of Melbourne Rare Book Week. Well, giving this year's Rare Books Lecture is one of Melbourne Law School's own, Dr. Lucie O'Brien. Dr. O'Brien is a Postdoctoral Fellow in the Melbourne Centre for Commercial Law, whose current postdoctoral research examines bankruptcy in Australian law and literature through an interdisciplinary lens. Lucie first joined Melbourne Law School and the Centre to collaborate on a major empirical study of Australia's personal insolvency laws to examine whether bankruptcy and debt agreements offer effective relief to people experiencing severe financial hardship. More recently, she contributed to an empirical study examining the harms associated with non-mainstream financial products, including buy now, pay later services and point-of-sale credit. Prior to her academic career, she practiced in the community legal sector, specialising in civil law policy and access to justice issues. Dr. O'Brien is also a member of the International Australian Studies Association and the Legal Humanities Association, and Treasurer of the Australian and New Zealand Law and History Society. This evening's lecture centres on the Fortunes of Richard Mahony, Ethel Richardson's 1930 Australian literary classic, published under her pen name Henry Handel Richardson. The novel traces the financial and psychological decline of its protagonist against the backdrop of the 19th century Victorian goldfields. Although set in 1800s Victoria, its themes remain strikingly contemporary: credit, insolvency, financial speculation, economic insecurity, and the human consequences of debt and financial decisions. This evening, Dr. O'Brien will use Richardson's work as a lens through which to explore bankruptcy law and its treatment in English and Australian literature. Following the lecture, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, so please save up all those questions for the end. And I'd like to thank Carol Hinchcliffe, who will monitor and moderate the Q&A before offering a vote of thanks at the end. A reminder that tonight's event is being recorded and will be made available on our website in due course. But thank you once again for being here, and I hope you have a wonderful evening. Please join with me in welcoming Lucie O'Brien.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for your generous introduction. I'd also like to thank Carol Hinchcliffe for inviting me to give this rare book lecture. It's an honour to be part of this lecture series that has included so many immensely distinguished scholars. And it's wonderful to be giving it here at Melbourne Law School, where I studied as an undergraduate in this very room, and where I've been privileged to work with wonderful colleagues for 12 years. I'd like to acknowledge that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri Wurrung people and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. What is bankruptcy? Bankruptcy, or as it's sometimes called personal insolvency, is a legal process designed to deal with people who can't pay their debts. It has two main functions: to distribute any assets that the debtor might have in a way that's fair to all his or her creditors, and to cancel any remaining debts so that the debtor can effectively start again. The first English bankruptcy statute was enacted in the reign of Henry VIII in 1542. It was extremely punitive, essentially treating debtors as criminals. It wasn't until 1705 that bankruptcy law allowed those who were bankrupt to discharge their debts or cancel them. And even then, this was only available to those engaged in certain trades. It wasn't an option for people who simply ran up debts due to extravagance or financial mismanagement. The aim of the law was essentially pragmatic, to promote commerce, and for that reason it was only available to certain privileged traders. Going bankrupt continued to attract significant suspicion and social stigma. The novelist Daniel Defoe, who himself went bankrupt several times, explained in a pamphlet in 1697 that there was an important distinction to be drawn between the honest debtor, who fails by visible necessity, and the knavish, designing, or idle, extravagant debtor, who fails because of excesses or on purpose to cheat and abuse his creditors. Even after 1705, most debtors still face the prospect of indefinite imprisonment, and the conditions of their imprisonment could be incredibly harsh. In 1729, a parliamentary inquiry found that debtors in the Marshalsea prison in London were tortured and starved by the wardens unless they were able to pay for preferential treatment. In the 1800s, England witnessed an exponential rise in bankruptcy rates, fuelled by rapid industrialisation, a surge of speculative investment and new technologies, especially railways. Reformers argued on utilitarian grounds that in a complex, credit-based society, some financial failures were inevitable. They pointed out that imprisoning debtors just didn't make sense. It simply wasted their economic potential and, in fact, made it impossible for them to repay their creditors. At the same time, humanitarian campaigners argued strenuously for reform on the grounds that the laws were cruel and unfair. Over time, these arguments won out, and a more lenient bankruptcy system came into being, restricting the circumstances in which debtors could be imprisoned. Imprisonment was finally abolished in 1869. The system also became more administrative and more complex. Between 1831 and 1914, almost 100 bankruptcy bills were introduced into the British Parliament. By the end of this period of frenetic law reform, England had a vast bankruptcy bureaucracy with an annual budget larger than that of the Treasury or the Home Office. This system served as a model for the Australian colonies and, in turn, the national Australian system created in the 1920s. This system was described by the Labor politician Frank Brennan in 1924 as a paternal interposition of the law in favour of the unfortunate. In 1936, a Commonwealth Parliamentary Committee declared that there was no longer any stigma attaching to bankruptcy. It said, and of course this has to be taken in the context of the Great Depression, which was just ending, a considerable section of the community finds the only way for relief from their debts is by sequestration, that is, bankruptcy. And it is not just to suggest that those unfortunates are under a stigma because they take advantage of an act intended for their relief. And this is how policymakers continue to talk about bankruptcy law today. That is, that it offers relief, that it's a shield that might be used in the last resort by an impecunious debtor to seek relief from his or her overwhelming debt. In policy debates, we mainly argue about how bankruptcy law can be more effective in giving debtors a fresh start, a chance to recover from financial hardship and start over. So Australian bankruptcy law presents itself as compassionate, benign and enlightened, a form of protection from the rapacious demands of the economy. I'm going to turn to literature now, you might be relieved to hear. In the Victorian era, we see a divergence between legal and literary discourses surrounding debt and bankruptcy. While the law became more forgiving, as I've just described, many writers of fiction continued to associate bankruptcy with extravagance, folly, shame and disgrace. The figure of the profligate, duplicitous bankrupt was a recurring character in novels of the Victorian period. A classic example is the character Augustus Melmotte in the corporate swindler in Anthony Trollope's 1875 novel, The Way We Live Now. Melmotte rises to unprecedented commercial greatness as the head of the South Central Pacific and Mexican Railway. He dazzles London society with his extravagant displays of wealth, pushing the stock price up and up. But it turns out that he's a fraud. The railway never existed except on his brilliantly printed company prospectus. With his forged documents and shady past, Melmotte embodies the Victorian association between bankruptcy and dishonesty. Colonial Australians, that is, European settler colonists, read vast quantities of English fiction in this period, and their perceptions of bankruptcy were undoubtedly shaped in significant ways by English writers like Trollope. We see this in The Miracle of Repair, a novella published anonymously in 1897 by Kay, a certificated bankrupt. This intriguing volume is held in the Ferguson collection in the National Library of Australia. In it, the anonymous author, Mr. Kay, describes his development from a spoilt child of a Church of England minister into an adult leading a godless, irreligious life that leads inevitably to financial ruin. He tells us that from an early age, his moral weakness was apparent from his excessive consumption of sweets. And from this bad beginning, he grows up, gets a job, marries, and becomes a father to 8 children. But somehow still finds time to taste of every sinful pleasure that man is capable of tasting, and drinking copiously of some of the most vile. Mr. Kay explains that decency forbids him from setting out in detail the iniquities into which he sank, but points his reader to the Bible for examples of the carnal, sensual, devilish behaviour that was fully exemplified in his downward course. After a series of financial mishaps, Mr. Kay finds himself in the bankruptcy court. He gets his certificate, that is, discharge from his debts. But this is not the end of his story. He demands, "Reader, have you ever become aware that you are spiritually bankrupt? For that, after all, is the most momentous bankruptcy." Kay tells his reader that he only truly experienced the miracle of repair through a spiritual awakening and repentance, and exhorts his reader to do the same. So although Mr. Kay clearly associates bankruptcy with moral weakness like Trollope, he also associates it with a kind of moral redemption. Now, I'm afraid A Miracle of Repair can't be considered a great work of literature. But some of the greatest writers of the Victorian era devoted their efforts and their genius to exploring the economic, social and moral dimensions of bankruptcy, none more so than Charles Dickens. The plight of debtors, especially imprisoned debtors, was a recurring theme in Dickens' work. This was something he knew about from personal experience. His own father was imprisoned for debt when Dickens was only 12. Dickens was taken out of school and sent to work in a factory to support his family. And the experience had a lifelong impact on him and his writing. He portrayed debtors' prisons in 3 of his most popular novels, The Pickwick Papers, Great Expectations and Little Dorrit. And these novels were extremely influential in shifting British public opinion in favour of more liberal bankruptcy laws. In The Pickwick Papers, Dickens describes the notorious Marshalsea where his father was kept. Many eyes that have long since been closed in the grave have looked round upon that scene lightly enough when entering the gate of the old Marshalsea prison for the first time, he writes. How soon have those same eyes, deeply sunken in the head, glared from faces wasted with famine and sallow from confinement, in days when it was no figure of speech to say that debtors rotted in prison, with no hope of release and no prospect of liberty. Like Mr. Kay, Dickens uses bankruptcy as a metaphor for a more expansive vision of moral redemption. This is perhaps most clearly articulated in his 1848 novel, Dombey and Son. In it, the titular character starts out as a domineering, workaholic businessman who treats everyone around him, including his wife and children, with contempt. After the failure of his business, Dombey sits alone in his empty house, a spectral, haggard, wasted likeness of himself brooding over the empty fireplace. After a period of solitude and intense suffering, he's reconciled with his daughter and ends the novel a devoted father and grandfather. His bankruptcy has punished him and humbled him, curing him of his obsession with wealth and power. In this sense, as Barbara Weiss has observed, the novel seems to conclude with the triumph of Christian values, the victory of love over money. Now, I've said that the Australian bankruptcy system was heavily influenced by that of England, and that culture was also influenced by novels like Anthony Trollope's. And Dickens also was idolised by colonial Australians. His work was read and discussed and adapted for the theatre in every Australian city and country town. There's no doubt that he influenced colonial Australians' perceptions of bankruptcy. But this is not the whole story. In fact, the Australian colonies were marked from the outset by a strikingly pragmatic attitude towards debt. The colony of New South Wales abolished imprisonment for debt in the 1840s, long before this occurred in England. And the apparent tolerance of bankruptcy became more pronounced after gold was discovered in Victoria in the 1850s. The English barrister Sir George Stephen, who arrived in Melbourne in the 1850s, was aghast at the laxity of Victoria's bankruptcy system. In a pamphlet published in 1855, he noted the inundation of moneyless adventurers seeking gold and the derangement of all the accustomed operations, I might almost say all the intellect of the colony, immediately following the gold discoveries. He noted that with fewer inhabitants than Manchester, the failures are nearly as frequent as in all of England. And he attributed this to a culture of wild speculation that was, in his view, unique in the history of the British Empire. So Stephen became a prominent bankruptcy lawyer in Melbourne and continued to write pamphlets denouncing the bankruptcy system. In an 1868 pamphlet entitled Insolvency Abuses, he declared that any system which in its practical operation promises the debtor not only impunity but actual relief in consequence of his fraudulent conduct is radically wrong, and I may add in stronger language, morally infamous. Now, Sir Stephen was not alone in this view. In 1857, the Melbourne Chamber of Commerce established a special committee to examine the bankruptcy laws, noting that they were the subject of universal complaint. But both were swimming against the tide of public opinion. In October 1865, the Ballarat Star wrote, "It's easy to moralise upon the speculative tendencies of the public of Victoria, and to abuse the gambling spirit of the times, but not all the wrath of the righteous will do away with the fact." And the Bulletin agreed, declaring resignedly in 1896 that Melbourne today is the paradise of reckless insolvents. This unique culture emerges clearly from Australian literature of the period, which often turns to bankruptcy as a source of humour. Henry Lawson furnishes one of my favourite examples in his story Settling on the Land, first published in 1893. Now, Henry Lawson was born in a tent on the goldfields in Grenfell, New South Wales in 1867 and had an itinerant childhood as his family moved around the colonies searching for gold. He was naturally shy and was bullied at school. At age 9, he began to lose his hearing due to an ear infection, and by 14, he was almost totally deaf. Lawson suffered from severe depression throughout his life and gradually succumbed to alcoholism. He was jailed for debt several times and died almost destitute. In the years leading up to his death in 1922, he could often be seen on the streets of Sydney begging for change or just striking up conversations with passers-by. Lawson loved Dickens and shared his deep compassion for people who were in debt, especially those living on the margins of society. In his writing, which was immensely popular, he tried to portray the life of the outback, not to romanticise it, but to document how hard it was for ordinary people, miners, small farmers, and itinerant labourers. Now, like so much writing by settlers, Settling on the Land doesn't acknowledge the violence of colonisation or the trauma it caused to Aboriginal people. But the story is still bitterly critical of the colonial project. Its title is ironic. For Lawson, the process of settling on the land is not a narrative of progress. It is, in fact, a story of grotesque, mindless destruction of the natural environment and of human lives. In the story, Tom the Selector leaves his job in Sydney to take up some land at a place called Dry Hole Creek. He battles heroically through a succession of disasters: drought, flood, hailstorms, tree roots that ruin his plough, diseases that wipe out his stock and spoil his crops, and a squatter on the neighbouring property who repeatedly burns down his hut. After each crisis, Tom picks himself up and tries again. As Lawson observes dryly, there was grit in that man. His farming career comes to an abrupt end when the bureaucrats from the city finally turn up to map the selection. They redraw the boundaries with the result that the land he's been farming becomes the property of the squatter next door. The squatter sues Tom for trespass and bankrupts him. And at this point, Tom finally snaps and is admitted to a lunatic asylum. But the story doesn't end there. The squatter himself turns up in the lunatic asylum the following summer, having been ruined by the drought, the rabbits, the banks, and a wool ring. After his release, Tom is philosophical about his experience. He says his one great regret is that he wasn't found to be of unsound mind before he went up country. Now, where Lawson's story treats bankruptcy with bitter irony, we see a different kind of humour in the writing of Joseph Furphy, the author of the novel Such is Life. Unlike Lawson, Furphy was not a professional writer, but like Lawson, he had considerable first-hand experience of financial failure. Born in 1843 in the Yarra Valley in Victoria, he tried to make his fortune on the goldfields, but failed and took up farming instead. He lost his farm in a drought, and then worked as a labourer and later a bullock driver until drought and disease killed his bullocks. He ended up working in a foundry belonging to his brother in the Victorian town of Shepparton. For over 20 years, Furphy worked in the foundry by day and spent his nights reading and working on the manuscript that would become Such is Life. In 1897, he sent the manuscript, written in copper plate, to the publisher of the Bulletin, and it was published in 1903. Now, Such is Life was not a success with the public. As Manning Clarke has written, critics instantly recognised it as a minor classic, but a classic which few were to read, and no one was ever able to establish what it was all about. The novel follows its narrator, Tom Collins, on a desultory path through the Riverina with a bullock cart. It's largely given over to his philosophical ruminations, interspersed with zany anecdotes and brief encounters with other characters who drift in and out of the narrative for no particular reason. Stylistically, Such is Life is very different from the Lawson story, Settling on the Land, where Lawson is terse and darkly ironic. Furphy is ebullient and whimsical. But like Lawson's story, the novel is infused with a fatalistic sense of the precariousness of life in the Australian bush, where financial ruin seems almost inevitable. Philosophy is no warrant against destitution, Tom Collins reflects at one point, as biography amply vouches. Neither is tireless industry, nor mechanical skill, nor artistic culture, if unaccompanied by that business aptitude which tends to the survival of the shrewdest. Continually impending calamities menace with utter destitution any given man, though he may bury his foolish head in the sand and think himself safe. There lives no one on earth today who holds even the flimsiest gossamer of security against a pauper's death and a pauper's grave. Where are one half of the fortunes of 20 years ago? And where will the other half be in 20 years more? We're all walking along the shelving edge of a precipice. Any one of us may go at any moment or be dragged down by another. And so he goes on and on and on. It's been called Australia's Moby Dick, and I think it's an apt comparison. Furphy is extremely interested in the law, but he certainly doesn't credit it with any kind of moral authority or redeeming power. One of his many acquaintances, known only as Dick L., is a qualified lawyer, a mine of rare information and queer experiences. Educated for the law, Tom Collins tells us, his innate honesty had shrunk from the practice of his profession, and he had taken to rambling as people take to drink. Unfortunately, Dick's many encounters with the law are not auspicious. He has a genius for attracting the wrong kind of police attention. Some men, by their very aspect, seem to invite confidence. Others insult, others imposition. But Dick seemed only to invite arrest. Fortunately, thanks to his forensic training, Tom Collins tells us, interviews with the majesty of the law seemed homely and grateful to him. When he gets in front of a judge, he can converse with the bench in such terms of respectful camaraderie that he's invariably let off. So much for the law. For Tom Collins, it's not law, but language, and specifically literature, that have the power to redeem the harsh, impoverished life of the bushman and transfigure it into something meaningful. The transfiguring power of literature is embodied in his friend Rory O'Halloran. In many ways, Rory is a caricature of the naive, superstitious Irishman. "You're a Catholic, aren't you, Rory?" Tom speculates one evening, struck by the simple piety of some asinine remark he had made. But Tom concedes that Rory's character has a genuinely spiritual dimension. A long term of communion with the backcountry will never leave a man as it found him. Outside his daily avocation, he becomes a fool or a philosopher. And in Rory's case, the latter seems to have been superimposed on the former. It transpires that Rory is in fact an aspiring author. He spends his nights working on a theological feminist treatise entitled A Plea for Woman. Now, Furphy seems to be suggesting in a very obscure and roundabout fashion that by communing with nature in the outback, it's possible to find a kind of literary inspiration that makes up for all the privations and the poverty. But the Australian tolerance of bankruptcy, almost verging on a fatalistic acceptance, is not limited to rural settings. The bankruptcies of city dwellers provide material for comedy and satire as well. This poem, published anonymously in the Bulletin in 1922, is typical of the genre. It depicts a miserable debtor appearing before the court with bleary eye, crimson-tinted nose and shaky hand. The arresting constable advises the court that the accused had once been very handsome, a favourite of the ladies, in fact an Adonis, the most sought-after man in Melbourne. 20 years on, he's a destitute alcoholic. The Bulletin intones, "He points a good old moral, does this stone-broke human sink, that ladies lead to betting, and betting leads to drink." As I've already mentioned, the Englishman Sir George Stephen believed that the Victorian colony's morally infamous attitudes to debt and bankruptcy could be traced to the gold rush, a time when spectacular fortunes were made and lost and made again, literally overnight. And we find some support for Stephen's claim in the work of a writer who was very different from Lawson and Furphy, but who also had bitter personal experience of financial hardship. Henry Handel Richardson was born Ethel Richardson in Melbourne in 1870. Today, she's perhaps best known for her school story, The Getting of Wisdom, which is based on her own experience as a boarder at PLC in Kew. As a young woman, Ethel Richardson was an exceptionally talented musician. After PLC, she travelled to Europe to study piano, but she eventually decided she wasn't going to succeed as a concert pianist and turned to writing. And it turned out she was even better at writing than she was at playing the piano. Richardson moved to England with her husband, a scholar of German literature, where she began to write The Fortunes of Richard Mahony in around 1910, when she was 40 years old. She returned to Australia in 1912, briefly, to do some historical research for the book, which is set from the 1850s to the late 1870s. The 3 volumes of The Fortunes of Richard Mahony were published separately in 1917, 1925 and 1929. The title character is based on Richardson's own father, who died of syphilis when she was only 9 years old, plunging his family into poverty. The trilogy leaves us in no doubt that watching her father succumb to this terrible illness was deeply traumatic for the young Ethel. In her fictionalised account, someone says that the father's death would lift a shadow from the lives of his children and confidently predicts that they're still so young they'd soon forget. But Ethel Richardson didn't forget. In fact, she spent almost 20 years writing the story of her father's life and transmuting it into something of epic proportions, a story that captures a seismic shift in human history. The Fortunes of Richard Mahony is in some ways a national allegory, specifically an allegory of Australia's white settler colonial experience. It tells the story of an Irish emigrant, a doctor, who moves back and forth between Australia and Europe, searching unsuccessfully for a place where he feels he belongs. This plot is emphasised by the names given to the 3 volumes: Australia Felix, The Way Home, and Ultima Thule, a Latin expression referring to a place beyond the boundaries of the known world. As Fiona Morrison writes, this allegory pivots on Richard Mahony both as an individual and a type, representing the colonial state of being caught in between. But the allegory is also a much more expansive one, an allegory of modernity, conceived as a shift from an age of faith to an age of science, an age of materialism. I'll come back to that later. The trilogy traces the first 30 years of Victoria's history as an independent colony. This was, of course, a time of extraordinarily rapid transformation and modernisation, fuelled by the discovery of gold in 1851. Richardson writes of the colony, its keynote was change. Fortunes were made and lost and made again before you could say Jack Robinson. Whole townships shot up overnight to be deserted the moment the soil ceased to yield. The people you knew were here today and gone, sold up, burnt out, or dead and buried tomorrow. As with Lawson and Furphy, this colonial environment is one of endless risk and constantly impending calamity. Some of these are familiar already from Lawson and Furphy. In the background, we hear about floods and droughts and diseases consigning farmers to ruin. But more often in Richardson's work, the risk comes from mining, and especially investment in mining shares. And she writes that the sense of uncertainty that characterised the early days had bitten too deep ever to be got out of the blood. Spend while you may remained the motto men lived by, and this led to a reckless extravagance that had not its equal. For Richardson, Victoria is a land of speculators and opportunists, like California, which had just had its own gold rush a few years earlier. Mahony can never accustom himself to the grasping, mercenary culture of his new home. He stands out in colonial society for his old-fashioned European manners and attitudes. Mary, his wife, loves him for this. Early in their courtship, she admires the bold flourish of his Dickens-like signature. But most people find his manners off-putting and strange. He speaks in a stiff, formal style. He doesn't drink. He unwittingly rebuffs many attempts at friendship and acts of kindness. After an unsuccessful stint as a miner and a brief attempt at running a general store on the goldfields, he resumes medical practice. But he refuses to advertise, to curry favour with potential patrons, to chase unpaid bills, or generally to engage in the mad scramble of money-making that defines the colony. Richardson ascribes this refusal at different times to his principles, his scruples, fastidiousness, and infernal Irish pride. The word pride echoes through the trilogy, and it is this flaw that marks him from the beginning as destined for tragedy. In some ways, Richard Mahony forms part of an Australian literary tradition of doomed heroes, like Rufus Dawes in Marcus Clarke's convict novel For the Term of His Natural Life, the explorer Voss in the novel by Patrick White, or Ned Kelly in his various cultural incarnations, most recently Peter Carey's True History of the Kelly Gang. But Mahony is unique in that he is instantly recognisable as a citizen of a modern capitalist or consumer society. He's a spendthrift, prone to impulse buying. He suffers from mortgage stress. He cares a lot about what other people think of his clothes, his house, his furniture. He's extremely relatable. And Mahony's life coincides with a period of radical change in the economic order, a period in which financial markets and financial institutions become integrated into the lives of everyday consumers. Today, we take it for granted that anyone can invest in the stock market, or either directly or through superannuation. We also accept that many of us will spend our entire adult lives in debt, starting with HECS and ending with a mortgage that we take with us into retirement. But these experiences were very unusual for the citizens of Melbourne in the 1850s, 60s and 70s, that is, investing and taking out a mortgage. And Mahony's decision to become an investor in mining shares changes the course of his life. Significantly, it is a lawyer who initiates him into this seductive and dangerous new world. When he first arrives in Victoria, Mahony dismisses the colonial mania for investing in stocks. He regards it contemptuously as an Arabian Nights way of growing rich. This changes when his lawyer, Henry Ocock, tips him off about some mining shares that are soon to increase dramatically in value. We already know by this point that Ocock is as unscrupulous as Mahony is fastidious. Mahony is initially forced to engage Ocock during his time as a shopkeeper when he's drawn unwillingly into a legal dispute over some goods that have gone missing in transit. Ocock employs some very shady tactics to win the case, much to Mahony's disgust and shame. Mahony is repulsed by the lawyer's calculating, opportunistic cast of mind and his suave professional manner. He instinctively realises that the unctuous blandness, the sleek courtesy was but a mask. Ocock was out to succeed at any price and by any means. It is Ocock who ensnares Mahony in the financialised economy, first by lending him £1,000 to build a house, and Mahony correctly intuits that he will never again be free of the incubus of debt. When Ocock offers Mahony the chance to invest in the Porapunka mine, it's a Faustian moment. Mahony initially rejects the offer, but then changes his mind. He allows himself to fall under the lawyer's spell, trusting his advice in everything to do with the stock market. From the moment Mahony becomes a shareholder in the Porapunka mine, the mining page is the first thing he turns to when he picks up his morning paper. His mind is consumed by the stocks, which seem to come alive as they leap up and down in value. Over the course of the trilogy, Mahony's stocks rise dramatically, making him briefly a millionaire. He buys a mansion in Brighton, a house he names Ultima Thule, the place beyond the bounds of the known world. This sudden undreamt of wealth causes Mahony to abandon his medical vocation to enjoy a life of luxury and leisure. But it always feels inevitable that he'll lose his money, and he does. By the 1870s, when Mahony is 50 and already in poor health, he's stone broke and forced to return to medical practice in a declining outback town with the faintly sinister name Barrambogie. From what I've said so far, it might sound like Richard Mahony follows the pattern of Dickens' Dombey and Son, or even Mr. Kay's novella, A Miracle of Repair, a narrative of greed, of failure, and ultimate redemption through the spiritual cleansing of bankruptcy. But unlike Dickens and Mr. Kay, Richard Mahony lives in a world in which humanism has been comprehensively swept aside by materialism. During his brief period of wealth and leisure, Mahony begins reading the work of the great moderns, Charles Darwin and his scientific disciples. Mahony is at once fascinated and horrified by the origin of species. He's long abandoned the superstitious religiosity of his Irish relatives, but he can't accept the scientist's contention that life and its properties can be explained to the last iota in terms of matter. He can't bring himself to believe that earthly life is followed only by eternal nothingness. Like many of his generation, Mahony becomes a fanatical adherent of spiritualism, the movement that believed it was possible to communicate with the dead through mediums, Ouija boards, and seances. While he's still wealthy and living in Melbourne, he attends many seances and becomes convinced that he's communicating with the dead, that the rappings and tappings and floating tables are genuine evidence of contact with another dimension. We, the reader, know that this is not true, that the mediums who are running these seances are actually charlatans profiting financially from his gullibility. But this all changes when the family loses its money and moves to Barrambogie. Mahony decides to set up a practice in the town because he's heard a rumour that an old mine there is about to be revived. But this never happens. The town sinks further and further into economic decline, and leaving the family stranded and heavily in debt. Increasing financial worries take a terrible toll on Mahony. His lifelong insomnia becomes chronic, and he lies awake night after night while bills and bad debts, shares and dividends and calls, payments on the mortgage, redemption of the capital, dance a witch's Sabbath in his head. But it's not just financial stress that leads to his catastrophic physical and mental breakdown. Rather, it's the sudden, tragic death of his 6-year-old daughter, Lally. After Lally dies, Mahony sinks into a kind of psychosis. He starts to believe that he sees her ghost and that he's receiving messages from her. But without the aid of a professional medium, the messages quickly peter out and his faith falters. At last, he's forced to accept that the ghost and the messages were an illusion. Mahony's breakdown can be traced to this moment, a moment in which financial ruin coincides with a profound spiritual crisis. The people who told him the Barrambogie mine would resume operations were, it turns out, only trying to sell him a house that no one else wanted. And similarly, the mediums who convinced him that he was communicating with spirits were purely trying to make money out of him. In both cases, he's been tricked by a ruthlessly commercial culture in which the profit motive reigns supreme. This is where Richardson's trilogy departs radically from the bankruptcy novels of Dickens. For the debtors in Dickens' novels, there's always hope. After suffering failure, humiliation and disgrace, his debtors are purged of their hubris and pride and emerge morally purified on the other side. The plot, which we see again and again in Dickens' novels, is suffused with Christian humanism. Even though Dickens was acutely conscious of the flaws of his society, its venality and hypocrisy, his fiction expresses a deep and enduring belief that other values can triumph, values like honour, duty, self-sacrifice, compassion. But in Richardson's colonial Australia, a world entirely given over to capitalism, Mahony can't believe this. In his paradigm, bankruptcy can only mean social and spiritual annihilation. The philosopher Martha Nussbaum has written that good literature is disturbing in a way that history and social science writing frequently are not, because it summons powerful emotions, it disconcerts and puzzles, it inspires distrust of conventional pieties and exacts a frequently painful confrontation with one's own thoughts and intentions. Nussbaum asserts that literature and the literary imagination are subversive because they challenge accepted norms and offer other ways of imagining the world. This is not just subversion for its own sake. Rather, by cutting through our self-protective stratagems, Nussbaum argues, good literature makes us aware of our own and others' vulnerabilities. In so doing, it can lead us to alter some of our standing judgments, not only about others, but about ourselves. The biting irony of Henry Lawson and the rambling soliloquies of Joseph Furphy are both, in a sense, subversive. By making light of financial failure, they challenge the Victorian moralising narrative that once associated bankruptcy with vice. But the Fortunes of Richard Mahony is subversive in a way that is far more contemporary and therefore more unsettling. Richardson's trilogy speaks very clearly to our own age, to our own moment in modernity, a moment of relentless and disorienting change. In 2026, artificial intelligence is emerging as a profoundly disruptive force, even more disruptive than the gold rush was for the fledgling colony of Melbourne in 1851. Last Saturday, Sam Altman announced that OpenAI has entered singularity. That is, it's surpassed human intelligence and become impossible for us to control. Altman believes that this is going to be incredible, hugely positive and awesome for the world. But many of us fear that it'll be the opposite, producing spectacular wealth for a few while consigning millions of others to permanent unemployment. The impact of climate change is already costing us billions of dollars each year in property damage and making some places uninhabitable. We live in a state of uncertainty that is perhaps unique in human history. But the work of Richard Mahony, the world of Richard Mahony, is our world too. And it prompts us to ask ourselves how much faith we can place in the legal frameworks that are meant to protect us in the event of a financial catastrophe. Whether it's business failure or redundancy, physical or mental illness, a bereavement, or some other crisis like a flood or a bushfire. How much can we trust the law when it offers us compassion, relief, and a fresh start? To what extent is the law, in fact, complicit with the extractive capitalism that is making our lives so precarious? By prompting us to ask these questions, Richard Mahony poses a challenge to 21st century readers that is at once distinctively Australian and universal in scope. How do we respond? Through spirituality, through philosophical reflection or creative expression? Or simply by trying to find a way to laugh at the situation in which we all find ourselves? I don't know which is the most useful response, but good literature allows us to do all those things.